Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Martin Lindsay, Board Chair of Culinary Historians of San Diego. I'm happy you're all here. We're going to be having Jim Chevallier speak on feasting with the Franks. And where are my notes? Here they are. Am I sharing my screen now? I hope I'm not. San Diego Culinary Historians of San Diego is a charitable nonprofit that brings free lectures to San Diego area and everywhere now via Zoom about the history of food and how it relates to culture and pretty much every facet of our lives. Our membership benefits the San Diego Public Library and helps us put on presentations like this and contribute to the library's collections. This morning, we have culinary historian and author Jim Chevallier returning with his Feasting with the Franks. Our next presentation will be The Glorious American Soda Fountain with Charles Perry, president and co-founder of the Culinary Historians of Southern California. Probably on Zoom as well. We're not really sure when the library is opening up for live presentations. And that'll be at 10:30 Pacific time, Saturday, May 15th. And we're going to be posting an Eventbrite page later on today. But today, although the term medieval food typically refers by convention to late medieval food, enough information survives on the early medieval food of France, and that is the food of the Franks, for us to know all key ingredients, the major cooking methods, some of the standard dining practices, and even a few of the actual meals. Jim's talk will outline the essentials of compiling a Frankish feast, along with the details on less upscale cuisine and how this early medieval food compares to the more familiar late medieval food. Jim Chevalier's food history career began with exploring the history of the croissant and the baguette, and soon expanded to the wider subject of French bread history and how the history of Parisian and early medieval food in 2019, and in 2019, Choice magazine named his A History of the Food in Paris, an outstanding academic title for that year. His history of French bread before the baguette is a Gourmand World Cookbook Award winner for 2020. And his most recent book is They Came Bearing Bread. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Jim Chevallier.
Thank you, Martin. Virtual bow. So, yes, I'm going to be talking about feasting with the Franks. And as you know, the Franks were the first rulers of medieval France. So we are indeed talking about medieval food. We are talking about early medieval food. Now, if you don't know anything about medieval food, or maybe even if you do, you might be wondering what's the big deal with early medieval food. So let's start with the fact that the Middle Ages are generally, just not going here. Let me see. There we are. The Middle Ages are generally said to go from the 5th to the 15th century, sometimes a little schematically from the fall of Rome to the fall of Constantinople. And that's about 1,000 years. With that in mind, let me read you this entry from Alan Davidson's Companion to Food. This is written by Barbara Santich. Medieval cuisine, a phrase which usually refers to Western or Christian Europe and to the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. There is good reason for this. Almost all we know of medieval cuisine has been derived from written sources, and the oldest surviving culinary manuscript from Christian Europe was most likely composed in the first half of the 13th century. Now, one might quibble with aspects of this, but basically it's a pretty good summation of the general idea of medieval food, which is that it's a term which applies to just a few centuries at the end of the Middle Ages. What this means is that when you hear terms like medieval cuisine, medieval food, By convention, these terms omit the food of not only some of the Middle Ages, but of most of the Middle Ages. And I thought that was rather a shame, so I began to look around and discovered, in fact, there's quite a bit of information about food in the early Middle Ages. It's just not in cookbooks. There's probably under 30, maybe even under 20 prime sources from the period, but they were all in print by the 19th century. A lot of them are in Latin, which can be an issue, but they were available. In terms of archaeology, we have an ever growing body of knowledge, largely thanks to a wonderful system called rescue or preventative archaeology. And what this means is that when somebody in France breaks ground and they find something of historical importance, and in France that happens a lot, they have to let archaeologists come in for a limited period of time and find what they can. The result in the last few decades has been an ever-growing body of knowledge about early France, notably the Franks, who left a lot of stuff. With this, we have increasing specializations in archaeology, like carpologists. A carpologist studies plant life, which of course has a lot to do with food. There are archaeologists who specialize in meat and butchering methods. So not only do we have more information, we have more ways of casting light on it. And it's really an ever growing and ever more exciting field. Now, before I get into the food, I'm going to assume a lot of you are like me when I began this research, in that you don't know that much about early medieval France. I'm not sure that most French people know that much about early medieval France. So let me give you a really compact overview. You get to the 5th century, and Gaul is a Roman province. The people there consider themselves Romans. There's all kinds of remnants of Roman civilization around, aqueducts and amphitheaters and baths of that sort. Their neighbors consider them Romans. We call them Gallo-Romans today, but that's just to differentiate the people from that area. They were Romans in the period. For some time before this, at least a century, various so-called barbarian groups, largely Germanic groups, had been attacking Gaul, and a lot of the cities had to shrink, as did Paris, to defend themselves. One of these groups was in the north. It's a loose confederation of tribes called the Franks. And one group of Franks very early on took over Cologne, which had been Roman. But then we have this whole group of Franks, often called the Salian Franks, who lived in what is now the south of Belgium and the north of France. So they were very close to the Romans and to Gaul, and they knew the civilization very well. One of the leaders was a man named Childeric, and Childeric actually held rank in the Roman army, so he was very familiar with the Roman lifestyle. No doubt that was true of his son, Clovis, as well. And around 480, Clovis began to take over the north of Gaul. For a long time, this has been presented as a horrible, destructive conquest, but in recent years, people have re-examined it. Gregory of Tours himself claims that the Gallo-Romans actually wanted the Franks to take over. Bear in mind that the central government at this point really wasn't keeping very good control of the outlying provinces. And in fact, Clovis himself defeated a very minor figure. He certainly didn't defeat the major Roman armies. And he let the Romans continue to live under Roman law very soon after he converted, with some, not all of his warriors. He wrote down, he had the laws, their traditional laws written down in what's called the Salic law. As he put out new laws, they were put out in Latin. They began to finance monasteries and churches. Now, ultimately, the Franks would take over all of Gaul, but for about 200 years, the south remained very Gallo-Roman. So a lot of what we know about Roman culture continues to apply in the south. What you have in general for several hundred years is a slow melding of a Latin and a Germanic culture overlaid over what remained of a Celtic culture, because the Gauls had never completely disappeared. This first group, this first family, was supposedly descended from a certain Merovich, who might have been a sea creature. And so they're called the Merovingians. As time went on, they began to decline, and the French call them the first race, and then a group named for Charles Martel, the Carolingians, began to arise. They didn't actually take power till 751, but they were very much in the ascendance before that. Ultimately, of course, the most famous Carolingian was Charlemagne, who would end up ruling all over most of Europe as an empire, as did his son, and then his grandsons fought and quarreled and split everything up, creating France and Germany in 888. Now, that's roughly the end of the period we're talking about. The period we're talking about is a little fluid. The Merovingians were far more chaotic than the Carolingians. They were forever breaking up their kingdoms and betraying each other. The Carolingians, until that last breakup, were pretty organized and pretty coherent, which may be one reason they triumphed. And we'll see other differences as we go along, but just in general, it's good to know these two major dynasties existed. Of course, the third race, as the French say, was the Capetians, who would rule up until the Revolution. Now, when it comes to food, the best way to introduce you to the food is to show you some actual Frankish dishes. And we are lucky we can do that because in the 1930s, a German archaeologist in Cologne did excavations underneath the church of Saint-Séverin. Saint-Séverin, of course, is a Christian church, but the graves he found were pagan graves, as we'll see. And these were from the Franks who had first invaded Cologne at the start of the 5th century, and these graves were from early on in the 5th century. Notably, he found the graves of 2 little boys. And you see the axe heads with the handles going to each little boy's hand. These boys were buried as warriors. Then we see various vessels with them. Now, we don't know if they were buried at the same time, in which case this is all one meal, or if they were buried separately, in which case, and I think this less likely, these were 2 separate meals. Funerary offerings would last into the Christian period because the church had trouble ending the custom. But generally, when you find them, you know you're looking at a pagan grave unless there's some distinct sign of Christianity. And what people would do sometimes is just put the food in with the grave and bury it. And sometimes they would actually have a feast by the graveside and then leave everything in the grave. And that appears to be what happened here, because if you look at this first vessel at the left, you have a bunch of eggs, and some of the eggs have been eaten. They were probably raw eggs. The Franks didn't know how to hard boil eggs, but these were probably raw eggs. And that shows us that people were eating right by the grave. There's something to note here which may be speculative, but these were fairly Romanized Franks from other evidence. And the formal Roman meal was said to go from eggs to apples. It began with things like eggs and lettuce and a few different foods. So it's possible that here there was a nod to the Roman formal meal. Very speculatively. Now we go to the next set of vessels. The top one is a Roman style glass bowl, and in this bowl there are bird bones, probably chicken bones. That's the bird most often found in Frankish archaeology, and pollen. So this bird had probably been brushed with honey before being roasted. And if it was a chicken, we have honey roasted chicken. Not very exotic to our mind, but very much what they probably did eat at the time. The Franks ate a lot of chicken and they used honey a lot. This bowl was sitting on a very distinctive sort of vase. If you look at this vase, it almost looks like 2 wide-based cones fastened at the bottoms and then truncated on either end. So this kind of vase is called a biconic vase, sometimes a carinated vase, and it's very typical of Merovingian vases, not Carolingian, just Merovingian. But when you see a black biconic vase, it's probably at least from the Merovingian period. And archaeologists think it held edible fat, which is completely credible for the Franks, that they would just eat fat. And then we have this other vessel which held a bird. Unfortunately, we know nothing about it. We don't know how it was cooked. We're not sure what kind of bird it was. It is interesting that it was probably a formal meal, because this is a very, upscale graves. It was probably an upscale meal, and it had two different birds as key dishes. This recalls a passage in Gregory of Tours' 6th century History of the Franks, where he shows a man asking his cook to prepare a meal to impress all his friends and family, and the cook says, "Get me a bunch of chickens and I will do as you command." Now, note, he doesn't say, "Get me a bunch of different animals," as you might expect. He doesn't say, "Get me suckling pigs," which was a luxury item in the period. He says, "Get me chickens." Together with this grave, that rather suggests that when the Franks wanted a very formal meal, they would have birds and most likely chickens. We go to the next grave, and there is this pot with kind of a crinkled mouth, what the Germans call a clover pot. And it held birch pollen and yeast. Now, that suggests that it was either birch beer, which was still being made in Germany until a few decades before this excavation, or just hydromel made from honey that had been taken from birch pollen. Either are completely credible. We know that the Germanic roots drank a lot of mead or hydromel. But the fact that both the drinks, as we'll see, are in this grave is one of the reasons I tend to think this was all one meal across the two graves. The next item is a little bit more ambivalent because it showed signs of meat. There are chemical signs of meat. And then some oats, and sage and black mustard. So the original archaeologists just thought this was meat cooked in a broth of sage and black mustard. I can imagine other possibilities. One would be to brush some meat with sage and black mustard, maybe some oat gruel, and then roast it, or just make oatmeal and put some meat in it and sage and black mustard. I can tell you, I have tried to make all kinds of things with sage and black mustard because it sure sounds appetizing. I cannot get it to taste like anything, but you might want to give it a try. The next item is far more straightforward. It's millet gruel with pollen, so honey, and fat, probably bacon fat. So just millet gruel with bacon and fat, which is very credible. A porridge or gruel was not in the least lower class at this point, and you still see it on upscale Frankish tables centuries later. Millet would tend to be more from the south, but it was known early on in the north as well. So it's a very credible, very simple dish to find in a Frankish grave. And then this Roman style cup had signs of red wine. And again, this is a sign of the Roman influence because at this point, the Franks didn't make wine. If they got wine, they got it from the south and probably traded it with the Romans. So we already have quite a few items both to eat and drink here. About 10 years later, an archaeologist at the same site found another grave with hazelnuts and walnuts, which are very native to the area, and possibly dates. Now, it's important if they were dates because then they would probably have been imported all the way from Marseille in the south. We do know that later, under the Franks, they were imported at Marseille. Uh, but certainly, it's credible that Franks would have eaten, along with the local nuts, dates. At another grave from the 7th century, completely different location, they found waterlogged pears and peaches and cherries. And in general, we know the Franks ate a lot of the same fruit that's common in Europe today. But if you put this all together, you may not get a feast, but you certainly get a pretty ample meal. You can start with raw eggs if you want to have your friends sign a release, or hard-boiled eggs, honey roasted chicken, maybe make another bird, possibly with sage and black mustard or some other appropriate flavoring. You could try serving edible fat. There's usually somebody who will try it. Millet gruel with honey and fat. And then you can find some way to cook beef with sage and mustard, maybe some oats. And then for dessert, you have dates, hazelnuts, and walnuts, and pears and plums and other things if you like. And you could serve birch beer, not the birch beer you get in a bottle. You'd have to make your own, or hydromel, mead, and probably not a very good red wine, a very thin, sort of sour red wine. It's very unusual to find food in graves and know how it was prepared. There is another find where they found 3 vases with quarters of meat in them, beef, hare, and stag, and they had all been flavored with honey, and you can readily imagine roasting these with honey. They've found hazelnuts underneath what had been lit coal, so the hazelnuts were heated. And they found ribs. We know the Franks liked ribs, and it's easy to imagine brushing the ribs with honey before you cook them. Otherwise, here is an overview of the foods that have been found in archaeology. Now, we know of other foods, but in archaeology itself, the Gallo-Romans were still eating beef at upscale sites until near the end of the empire when they began to eat pork, and that was a favorite food of the Frankish elite. Pigs do no work, so their meat was probably more tender. But they did eat some beef despite a general idea that upper class Franks didn't eat beef. We know they did. Probably more often it was the more modest diners who ate the beef because oxen did a lot of work, so their meat would have been tough. Sheep and goat often look exactly the same in archaeology, so archaeologists call them caprinids. And when you put beef, pork, and caprinids together, you get what is called the triad. Sometimes these meats are all called butcher's meat. Now, when they can identify a caprinid in the north, usually it's sheep. In the south, sheep and goat were eaten more commonly. And there are butchery marks on horses, so we know they did sometimes eat horses, not a great amount, but sometimes. By far the most common bird found is chicken, followed by goose. Bird bones often don't last in archaeology, so other birds we know existed that are mentioned in texts don't appear in archaeology. And also fish bones don't usually last, and yet they have found pike bones. They've found bones of the trout and salmon family. Flat oysters are by far the most common shellfish, followed by mussels, and then cockles and scallops have also been found as well. From the Gauls on, you see far less game. Game was the result of a sport. It was not a way to get food. Hunting was just a sport, but you do find some game, above all hare and stag, the male of the red deer, followed at some distance by boar and then things like badgers and beavers and other small animals. Since the Romans, the main grain in Gaul was triticum aestivum, bread wheat, summer wheat, and that remained true under the Franks. It's been true ever since in France. The Romans introduced rye, and that had become pretty important by the Franks. Barley had been the main grain for the Gauls, and it remained the main grain in certain areas in the north. The Romans favored lentils, and you still see a lot of lentils early in the Frankish period, but it was increasingly the broad bean that was found, and they had found broad bean since the Gauls, often the smaller bean, which is a horse bean. The broad bean would be the main legume in France all the way up to the 18th century, and in general, just a very important food for all classes up until the 18th century. You wouldn't think that greens would survive, but they have found dill, celery, cilantro, which is a green of the coriander plant, fennel, parsley, summer savory, and beet. So they've actually found quite a few greens, and most of these are also mentioned in texts. The fruit that's been found is mainly very familiar to us today: pears and apples, grapes, plums, more rarely cherry and peach, and then essentially medieval fruit, the medlar, which some people still eat today, but it's far less common, and sloe, which is most often used for sloe gin. Hazelnuts and walnuts were the main nuts, being the local northern nuts. How do we cook all this? Well, we're in luck once again, because somewhere at the start of the 6th century, a doctor was exiled from Byzantium, a Greek physician named Anthemus. And Anthemus ended up in Ravenna, where the ruler was the great Ostrogoth king, Theodoric the Great. At some point, Theodoric sent him all the way north from Ravenna to Austrasia. Now, Clovis's sons divided up his kingdom, as was common. They didn't have primogeniture among the Franks. They divided everything equally. And so Theodoric ended up with what is called later Austrasia or northeastern Gaul. We think his capital at this point was in Reims, named for the Remi, a Gaulish tribe. Later it would be in Metz. It might have been in Metz at this point, but generally it's thought that it was in Reims. So that's where Anthemus went. And at some point, even though he's an ambassador, he put on his doctor hat and he wrote the king a long letter where he passed the king's diet in review. Today, this would be a nutritional document, basically. You know, you go to a nutritionist and say, hey, look at what I'm eating, what's the best stuff to eat. Back then, you'd call it a dietetic. And it's very useful because right off the bat, it tells us what foods were known in northeastern Gaul. When he mentions foods that he doesn't believe are found there, he says, I do not think this is found here. So that makes us more secure about the others being local to the area. It's called the Observatione Ciborum, observations on food, notes on food, the use of food. There are various ways to interpret the title. I've produced my own translation called How to Cook an Early French Peacock because there is a recipe in it for peacock. And the third edition is out now, by the way. Go looking for it, look for the third edition. Not only is it a wonderful inventory, but he actually does have recipes in it. Not many full recipes, but he does have a few. And notably, he has one for a kind of sweet and sour beef stew. This is interesting right off the bat because, again, the idea has always been that the upper class ranks didn't eat beef, and here he's recommending this to a Frankish king. So we know they did eat beef. It's also very interesting because it's a sophisticated recipe. It's a recipe that would have been made by a professional cook, a very Roman style recipe. The cook himself may have been from anywhere, but the recipe probably came from Byzantium, which was the heir to Roman culture at that point. Might have come from Ravenna because Theodoric did his best to maintain a very Roman style culture. But what's most interesting is because it's such a professional recipe, it's very structured. And so at each step, we can swap in another item we know existed in the time and ultimately create a bunch of different stews using period ingredients with a period method. First, you boil the meat to clean it. Now, my guess is probably this was to ease the gamey odor a lot of meat would have had at the time. It might sometimes have literally meant to clean it. And another idea you see in the late Middle Ages, nobody mentions it here, but it's a possibility, is that some of the meat would have been salted, and this might have been a way to leach out the salt. It's also where you choose your meat. So here he says use cow meat, but you could use pork, you could use mutton or lamb, you could use chicken or any of a number of other birds, hare, stag, boar, and maybe even chick. Really anything you could make a stew out of. So you boil it for about 15 minutes, then you switch out the water. And he says to boil until cooked, but really he probably means partially cooked because other things happen later. You could add legumes here. He doesn't say to do so, but we do have a mention of that elsewhere. And if you're going to add chickpeas or broad beans, this is probably where you want to put them in the water to cook for a while. And then you add vinegar. Now, vinegar was used all the way up through the late Middle Ages as a flavoring. It's very common flavoring. But you could substitute olive oil. You could substitute the Roman fish sauce garum, which is noted all through the early medieval period, or wine, which Anthemus himself uses elsewhere. So right off the bat, you can change the flavorings here. In the section on greens, he lists several greens and he says, if you'd like, when you're making a stew, you could cut these up into the stew. And here he tells us to use some specific greens. So this is a specific case of a general principle that he lists down elsewhere. And here he says to use leek. And you'd probably always use leek because it was a very important green in Germanic culture. I've never seen it in archaeology, but we certainly know they used it. Pennyroyal, we would probably use mint, would be somewhat safer. Celery and fennel. But you could use cilantro, you could use dill, you could use any of the greens that we saw were found in archaeology. So again, you can vary the flavors here quite a bit. Now, if we just stopped here, we would have a meat, we'd have a flavoring, we might have legumes if we want, and we'd have green. That would already be a pretty consistent sauce. But if you look at the one surviving Roman cookbook, De Re Coquinaria, the various ways the title occurs, very often the recipes use several, as much as 4 different cooking liquids. And so here we're going to have 2, which is like a stripped down version of a classical Roman recipe. So you cook the meat in water and vinegar or whatever you add in for about an hour, and then you put in honey. If you're going to put in honey, I would think you'd want to put it in towards the end. But again, you could substitute oil, garum, vinegar, wine. While this is cooking for about an hour and you keep basting it, you take some spices. And he particularly says to use very Roman spices. Pepper, which was the top spice for those who could afford it because it was fabulously expensive in the period. And the Romans mentioned pepper quite a bit too. And then spikenard and costus, which are very Roman spices. You see them just a little bit at the end of the Middle Ages, but essentially they disappear by the end of the Middle Ages. Elsewhere in his own work, he uses ginger, he uses clove, he uses coriander, and then we have other lists of spices in the period. So there's a whole list of different spices you could substitute here. And you pound all this with wine and you make a kind of spice paste. This is really interesting because it's one of the few detailed recommendations we have on how to use spices in a period recipe. You don't just mix them in the water, you get them together with some wine, and they must have blended somewhat together. It's interesting, too, that he gives you precise measurements for the spices. He doesn't give you any other precise measurements, so you have to know what the standard vessel size was for the period, which you could probably guess from the standard Merovingian pot. And then you put all this in at the very end, so that way it doesn't all boil away or dilute away. I should warn you, if you choose to make this recipe, that for modern taste, the vinegar is very strong. So you might want to play with proportions here. Otherwise, you won't taste all these nice spices you put in. But if you make this as written, you'll basically get a sweet and sour beef stew. I call it a Roman adobo. Or you could generate all kinds of other spices. Now, there's another recipe for lentils. I won't go into it in great detail, but one option in it is to use coriander with vinegar. And just coriander with vinegar makes very nice lentils. Then later he says to put some olive oil in it. And sumac. Sumac doesn't appear in Roman cuisine at all, so far as I know, and not in the West again for a very long time. So I kind of suspect him here of drawing on his Byzantine experience and not realizing it. But certainly it's very nice to use. If you've never used sumac, it's kind of a citrusy spice. You can often find it in Persian shops. And with the coriander, it goes very nicely. But if you just make lentils with vinegar and coriander and some olive oil, you get very nice lentils. He does have a recipe for peacock. I have no problem using turkey because peacock supposedly tasted like tough turkey. And when turkey appeared in Europe, it quickly replaced peacock on many tables. He says to cut up the turkey so we know you're not doing the old trick of dressing the turkey in its own feathers and you simmer it either in its own juices or red wine. And after a while, you add honey and pepper. Now, I sometimes take turkey breasts and I marinate them in red wine and honey and pepper, and then I broil them, and it's very nice. It works beautifully. When you're making mutton, he says to mix some salt into red wine and baste the mutton with the red wine and salt. Very simple, but just perfect for mutton or lamb. He gives detailed instructions on how to soft boil eggs because he prefers that, but he does say you can hard boil eggs. And he has a variety of instructions, most of which aren't quite recipes, but a number of which are just exactly what you need for that particular food. So they're perfectly usable. One thing that comes across as you read through all these different techniques he uses, broiling and grilling and stewing and basting, uh, is that he's using a Roman style kitchen. You may have seen a similar kitchen in Pompeii. Several have been found. There's a reproduction of one in London, so there was probably one in London. This is from Germany, and you see you've got this brick counter with a grill on it, and then off to the side you have a workspace. Often you would hang the various pots and pans above this cooking setup, and often you had a little oven too, not for making bread, for cooking meat. Anthema shows us all kinds of ways of using this setup. You can grill, strangely enough, on the grill. You can simmer foods. You can cook food under the coals. He says to cut quince crosswise and cook them under the coals. At one point, he says to cook meat away from the fire so that it becomes as if steamed, which I take to mean medium rare. And you can see how you could just take the meat and put it off to the side here and do all your other cooking. Meanwhile, the meat would very slowly be cooking from the coals. So his work, among other things, is kind of a manual on how to use one of those stoves that was found at Pompeii. Very likely, this was more common in the south of Gaul. Here we see a Frankish king using it. We do have another description of a royal cook's equipment, and that's more Germanic. It's a tripod with a pot hanging off of it, andiron, spits. And in simple households, and sometimes actually in some upscale residences I found, all you had was a fire with rocks or bricks around it. And that's what a hearth was. A hearth originally was just a fire, sometimes with a hole in the roof, typically in a small house, sometimes built outside in the bigger residences. And that was the main hearth and the main cooking setup a lot of people had. But some people did have this Roman setup. So if you work your way all the way through Anthemus's work, you can come up with a long list of fairly distinctive dishes. That sweet and sour beef stew, the roast mutton. You can baste suckling pig with brine. You can bake suckling pig, again, in that little oven, and then dip it in oxymel, which was honey and vinegar, a very common Roman flavoring. And note, this gives us a note that they did use dips as part of their flavoring. He says to boil bacon. He doesn't really approve of frying it. Not very appetizing, but it is distinctive. He also says that if you want to use bacon fat on greens, and people would, because sometimes oil was imported from the south, so it could be hard to get, and they would put bacon fat on greens. You could grill pork liver on the grill and use coriander and salt and oil on it. You have the turkey peacock recipe. You can make partridge breast with cilantro, uh, or baste roast squab, young pigeon with brine. You can make hard or soft boiled eggs. You can boil various fish with salt and oil in the water. Should you have some eel, you can broil it and baste it with brine once again. Shellfish, you just bake in their shells, a very intuitive way to make shellfish, and probably how most people did make shellfish. You could sun dry, endive, or boil it. He says to flavor turnips, put them with meat. So the meat actually becomes a flavoring for the turnips, and you add some vinegar. And you can see where that would be very flavorful, as simple as it is. His instructions for his instructions for broad beans are very simple, but they probably were very simple, just made with oil and salt. And then the lentil recipe, which is very nice. You could actually use rice, because even though it was not at all native to France, we do have evidence that it was imported, and later on there's specific mention of it being imported, and it has been found. It's actually been found in archaeology in Gaul. You could heat milk and add honey, wine, mead, or a little salt. You could have curds with honey. fresh sweet cheese with honey. He does not approve of boiling or roasting cheese, but the very fact that he says that people do it means that people sometimes thought it was okay. And you can imagine taking a nice little white cheese and adding some honey on it. That'd be very nice. And then you have all kinds of fruit you can add. You can cook the quince under the coals. He mentions almonds, pistachios, dates, dried figs, and raisins. You put all this together, you get quite a feast, and you can add in dishes from the Cologne grave. So at this point, yes, we do have a Frankish feast. Now, we have quite a bit of food here. We have quite a range of foods we know the Franks ate, both from texts and archaeology. What were the most likely foods? Well, we have what I call curated lists. So notably, there are several forms of them, but one were the requisition letters given to travelers as they went about on royal business. Now, some of these were very upscale people like bishops. Some were messengers who were probably relatively aristocratic, but not the highest class. So uh, these are requisition lists for people of some rank, but not necessarily the highest rank. And the first one we have is from a wonderful collection of fill in the blank forms. And I say fill in the blank, probably a scribe copied them over and just put in the amounts and the pieces that applied. So this one from around the 7th century has several items in it, but the food starts with clean or shiny bread. So it's probably white bread, pane nitido. The measurements are modiuses, modios, sometimes pounds, sometimes just amounts. So you have so many modios of white bread. You have wine, you have beer. Now, again, sometimes one traveler might only have wine, another traveler might only have beer. Bacon, which is always listed separately from meat, it's its own thing, and that's true very late into French recipes. Meat, which if it's just listed as meat, would probably be butcher's meat, only adult animals. If the local host was a hunter, maybe game would be acceptable, but you could also specify specific animals, pigs or suckling pigs, sheep or lambs. And the younger animals typically would have been for the more upscale people. The older animals would have been probably for the servants and the retinue. And then you have geese, pheasant, and chicken. Later lists of this sort sometimes mention other birds, but they always mention chicken. Chicken just recurs. And eggs. Uh, and again, the Franks really liked eggs, and they had various ways of eating them. You can imagine that when you're traveling, carrying eggs, you could just grab one and pop it and drain it down. It was one way to have a quick snack while you're still on your horse. Then you have some flavoring liquids, oil, fish sauce, honey, vinegar, a list of spices, some of which Anthemus already mentioned, but cumin, which would recur several times later and was probably the top spice overall after pepper. Pepper was the most expensive by far and the most common. You see pepper here. You see costus. You see clove. You see spikenard. And then probably for the first time for food, you see cinnamon. The Romans used cinnamon for things like funerals, but here we know it's being used for food. And that's a note on all these spices. Sometimes when you have lists of spices, they may be used for medical reasons. Here it's very clear they're being included among the foods. And then mastic, which you see much later in late medieval food as well. You have dates, pistachios, almonds, probably all imported, and wax candles, cheese. We know the Franks like dairy. It's rather striking. They would actually requisition cheese. Salt, which is not listed with the spices, not listed with the flavorings. It's off on its own. And then greens, and the greens would not only be salad greens, but herbs of various sorts, and legumes, which very often would be broad beans, but they could have been a number of other things. So we have here a more limited range of foods, but probably more common. It's interesting. Note something about the spices, which is that they assumed these could be found all through Gaul, that riding through Gaul, you could arrive at probably a relatively upscale monastery or an estate, and they would have some spices on hand. So these were not considered rare and unique in the 7th century. And we have all kinds of ideas of how to cook these things, thanks to Anthemus. We have a whole range of techniques. So this is just one more ingredients list, but a somewhat more limited list. Now, let me take you to a document which I don't have time to look at in detail. It's worth a whole talk, but it's a very important document. It's a very important one to know about for the time. When you took a bunch of chapters, they were known as capitals, you put them together, they became a capitulary. And there are various capitularies, but probably the most famous one is for the estates of either Charlemagne or his son. There's some uncertainty, and it's called the Capitulary de Villas. The University of Leicester has a very nice rendition of this on its site. You want to be careful in using the translation. It's the most common one, but it's got a bunch of errors in it. This is the last entry in 70, as you can see. And it lists all the various plants being grown there, plants and trees. It kind of mixes them in. So you have root vegetables with legumes, with salads. But you see it has costumary, that actually should be costus, which is not costumary at all. You have kidney bean, which is a post-Columbian bean, for physolum, and nobody really knows what the physolus was. It's a bean that handed its name over to the kidney bean later, but we don't really know exactly what it was. There's a mention of spinach later. Spinach into Europe until about the 12th century. So there are some errors in here, but overall, this gives you a very good idea of the plants they thought could be found throughout Europe in the time. Now, note, the estates themselves would have been all over the place and in very different climates. So clearly they couldn't have grown all these. This is a very idealized list of plants, as we'll see. Then you have house leeks, which aren't the leeks you eat. They're a special kind of plant you would actually put on your house to protect it from lightning. For trees, you mainly have the fruit we know today, as well as sorb fruit, medlar, and nuts mixed in with them. The quince, the hazelnut, the almond, and figs. So you have all kinds of mainly familiar fruit. What's really striking here is you have specific varieties of apples and pears, and we don't know most of them. Some, however, are sweet, some are bitter, and some keep well. That's interesting notes. Among the pears, there are ones that are said to be cooking pears, and this is the first mention I know of a fruit or vegetable being mentioned as a cooking fruit. So there is a lot to find in Capitulary de Villas. It's worth a whole talk, but that's just a glimpse at it. It goes along with some actual audits of actual estates in a document called the Brevium Exempla. And here we see that one estate, you had far less plants being grown. You had somewhat less trees. And in the other estate, you also had less plants being grown. And again, they say different kinds of pears, different kinds of apples. So there seems to be a growing awareness that you didn't just want to eat pears and apples, you want to eat the better ones for the better purpose. I want to look now at something that's often neglected in food history, and that is the food of the poor, especially in medieval food history. You see very little mention of it, and we actually do have information on what the poor sort of person ate in this period. First of all, people who did work for their masters, who might have been lords or might have been monasteries, had to be fed while they were working, if you wanted them to have any energy at all. At the Abbey of St. Maur in March, they got bread, and it would have been very whole grain bread. It was probably very filling and nutritious. Legumes, again, probably broad beans, and beer, which would have provided some nutrition. It was pretty thin beer. In May, you get bread and cheese. Lots of people would have bread and cheese for lunch today. It's not really very limited. But in October, they'd probably be doing the harvest. Sometimes they only got bread, which is hard to imagine. And if there was wine, they would get wine, which the poor didn't often drink. So they must have liked the wine. But it is interesting that were expected basically to live on bread. So the poor could really have a very minimal ration. You have a big monastery called Corby, and they actually would receive the poor for limited periods of time. They would give them mixed grain or maslin bread, as well as wheat or spelt bread, which would have been a better sort of bread, 2 cups of beer, and then either cheese or bacon and some legumes, as well as a small portion of eels. And it's tempting here to think, oh, that's for a fast day, but in fact, the idea of fish being closely associated with a fast day hadn't arisen yet. Or fresh cheese, and I presume they got the cheese when the main ration included bacon. So that right off gives us some idea of what the poor got to eat. Then we have, again from that book of fill in the blank forms, a very interesting document from somebody who has nobody to take care of them, not many means or income of any sort, and they're getting older. So they grant their land, I would think most often to the church, maybe to a lord sometimes, in return for being supported for the rest of their days. Now, right off the bat, it's interesting that somebody that poor actually could own land, but apparently they did end up with patches of land. And the idea of supporting somebody for the rest of their days still exists because in France you have this approach to real estate sales where you can buy a property in return for supporting the owner until the end of their life, which of course leads to some very interesting situations. Kevin Kline has a very funny film about it called My Old Lady. And this is basically the same principle in the early Middle Ages, a rente viager. They would get 2 suits of clothes a year and a sufficient ration of bread, beer, legumes, which again were probably broad beans, and milk, which was probably turned into milk, or I'm sorry, turned into cheese or butter. So they would live out their days on bread, beer, beans, and maybe cheese. Now, if you're thinking that sounds really boring, these are people who had struggled for food all their lives, who had probably been through some famines. I doubt their food was ever boring. And especially when they were guaranteed they would be getting it. That must have been very nice, although no doubt there was some dispute about what constituted a sufficient ration. Also, on fast days, they got meat, which they must have really looked forward to. They probably had kitchen gardens so they could flavor some of this. And the strictures on hunting were not yet by class. So if you could find land that was considered public land, even a poor person could hunt on it if they had the energy to do so. So we do have some idea of what the poor were eating in the period. And it's rather interesting to see, I think, all these different things. Uh, but as was seen, sometimes it was really just bread or bread and cheese. It could really be very, very minimal and maybe some rather thin beer. In the time we have left, I want to compare the food of our period, the early medieval food we just looked at, with what is generally considered medieval food, and that's late medieval food. So right off the bat, you have things that exist in one period, but not the other. So in the early Middle Ages, people still used the fish sauce garum, which of course completely disappeared by the end of the Middle Ages. They would put wormwood, absinthe, in beer or wine, sometimes mixing it with honey, so you got a bitter and sweet flavor. And as we've seen, some still use the Roman style stove. In the late Middle Ages, you had trenchers, which is from the French word tranchoir, because you tranched thing on it. You sliced uh, meat usually on a slicing surface, which could be made of metal, but the most famous trenchers are those made of hardened bread. And that was only around for a few centuries, but it's very characteristic of the late Middle Ages. Food in paste, which was dough, was called pastry, and pastry was pies, could be meat pies, flans, and tarts. And people of all class ate them in the late Middle Ages. They were essential to the diet. They didn't exist at all in the early Middle Ages. Sugar comes to the European diet. Verjuice, which is a juice originally made of small tart grapes. There are other ways of making it, but that was the original meaning. You have spinach now. Spinach has become a standard green. And you have mentions of citrus fruit, which you don't earlier. They probably existed way south, but in general, you don't see any references in the early Middle Ages. Here you even have orangeade, orangeade. So citrus fruit was now more present. In terms of the upscale diets, well, the main influence in the early Middle Ages was Roman, and I think we've seen that pretty adequately. In the late Middle Ages, there was a lot of Arab and Persian influence. In terms of butchery, the Romans actually had pretty sophisticated butchers, but the Franks basically cut the animal up into quarters and maybe took the rib cage out because they liked ribs. By the late Middle Ages, you get things like steaks, you get more detailed butchering. The Franks, at least at the start, still drank spiced wine. They drank the Roman conditum, and we have recipes for conditum. In the late Middle Ages, it was very common at the upscale tables to drink spiced wine, Hippocras, Piemont, claret. Now, to our taste today, these probably all taste like Swedish glögg or German glühwein. They probably wouldn't taste very different, but they were distinguished in the period. The hearth in the early Middle Ages was that little fire with some stones around it. And it's what most people probably used. The poor probably still use that in the late Middle Ages, but now you have the hearth as a fireplace, which is a very complex technical innovation. You have a flue, you have a back plate, you have all kinds of things to help the flow and the heat. And that appears in the late Middle Ages, not the early. The pots were typically pottery or brass. Only late in the period you start to get iron pots. And one implication of that is that people think that mortality in childbirth ended. And that would have been that would have been because women were now getting iron leached from their pots. The nuts were hazelnuts, walnuts, the native French nuts. You had imports of almonds and pistachios. In the late Middle Ages, you mainly got almonds. That you had other nuts, but almonds were used for almond milk. They were used for thickener. The original blancmange was chicken and rice and sugar and ground almonds. The spice palette. In the early Middle Ages, pepper was by far foremost, followed by cumin. You had ginger, cinnamon, clove, but they weren't associated in any particular way. And then you had spikenard and costus, which would fade towards the end of the Middle Ages. In the late Middle Ages, you above all had a mix that to Westerners today is a holiday mix, ginger, cinnamon, and clove, and related spices. And they were closely associated. Sometimes they're even mixed in Duke's powder. Uh, but they had no association in the early Middle Ages. Pepper was still expensive, but nowhere near as expensive as it had been. And you had other peppers. You had cubeb and long pepper. You had grain of paradise, and you had saffron, and you have a bunch of other spices that appeared. Sugar was a spice or a medicine, but it had no association with dessert. It was counted among the spices. We've seen the sweet and sour beef stew. They made drinks with absinthe and honey in the early Middle Ages. In the late Middle Ages, you see dishes with verjuice and sugar. So the sweet and sour preference existed all through the Middle Ages and then disappeared really until the influence of Asian food on Western food. That is pretty much my talk. I hope I have shown you that we have very good reason to distinguish between early and late middle-aged food because we do know quite a bit about early middle-aged food and we even have some idea of how to make it. Again, if you would like to look at some recipes for yourself and look at a bilingual edition of Anthemus's text, which I hope I've shown is very useful, well, you can go find How to Cook an Early French Peacock. And with that, I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was fascinating, and I'm super hungry right now. We have a couple questions. One thing I wanted to ask is where can people purchase your books?
Oh, well, how to cook an early French peacock is the usual places. Amazon, I think has them. I believe I've got a copy for Lulu as well, uh, but they're readily found in the standard venues.
All
So,
righty, that's good to know. Um, I have a question here from Donna. Can we tell from the bones, this is talking about the two children's graves. Can we tell from the bones if the chickens were roasted rather than cooked in some other fashion?
I'm not sure. I'm trusting the archaeologists on that because they reported it as being roasted with honey. Um, I'm really not sure. I don't think the archaeologists themselves say anything about it, so I'd be hesitant to make a statement about that.
Okay, then also
But
we,
it does make sense to use honey to roast, that to put it on the surface of the food.
yeah.
Just as a comment. Yeah, I'm sorry. Next.
Daniel asks, has there been any analysis done on the fat in those biconic vases to determine what kind of fat it was, either animal or vegetable fat, or
Well, it was almost certainly animal fat. They because they do have signatures for animals.
yeah.
Certain minerals and proteins appear. Exactly which animal, I'm not sure they could tell. I should say too that this was done in the 30s, so a lot of things that are doable now weren't doable then. Sometimes it's frustrating that discoveries have been made so long ago. There's some wonderful discoveries made in the 19th century. Unfortunately, they were ill-equipped to, analyze half what they found. So I'm pretty sure they could tell it was animal fat. I'm not sure they could tell if it was a particular animal's fat. But in general, we know from other sources that pigs were the most likely source of fat.
It's probably a good guess that it was animal fat then.
So
Um, One person asked, is there can a correlation be made between pagan feasts and burials at Dia de los Muertos? So we're not really talking about that, but pagan
uh,
feasts.
well, just let me point out that Dia de los Muertos probably comes from Aztec custom. So certainly not. It's a whole different tradition. Uh, and what about the pagan feast beyond that?
I would think that if there's any correlation between the Franks and the Aztecs, I would assume that it's more of a cultural similarity.
I have to point out something. This is very amusing. This isn't about the Franks, it's about the Gauls. A lot of you may know that Mexico City was supposedly founded when I think an eagle killed a snake. And that's a very vivid image that has great meaning, I think, in Mexico today. There are actually Gaulish coins showing an eagle killing a snake. So it's kind of eerie how that motif reappears, and it's not unthinkable that similar motifs can be
So
found.
to answer your question, yes, there is a correlation. Daniel,
Well,
well,
it's possible. I don't think there is.
yes, yes. Daniel asks, what's the context of the butchered horse remains? You had mentioned that horses had been remains of horses had been found.
Generally, they're found with other animal remains, and they they show signs of butchery. I don't know if they're
Yeah.
always in a kitchen. Sometimes you have kitchen collections. Sometimes you just have the bones, and they just look at the bones and they see if there were marks on them that indicate.
His intent here is that he says in Scandinavia they seem to have been part of a ritual meal, and possibly similar traditions existed among Anglo-Saxons and other German tribes.
Well, there have been associations made with the Scandinavian execution of horses and the ritual use. And then I think there were horse heads put on stakes in Germany for a while. Uh, that may have existed. It's probably less likely under the Franks because they were Christian. And it's striking, by the way, if you look at Anthemus's work, and he's writing for an early Frankish king, he doesn't mention horse meat at all. So you get the impression that if they're eating horse meat, they didn't want this person of Roman culture to know it. And generally, it was somewhat frowned upon. It wasn't actually banned by the church, but the church looked askance at it. So it probably was not used for religious reasons among the Franks. There is certainly evidence among Germanic groups like the Scandinavians. Yeah.
Question from Michael. Since they didn't have clocks, how did they keep time, or did they just take their best guesses while cooking?
Oh, uh, I think people got pretty intuitive about time overall because precisely because you didn't have clocks. And I'm not sure they didn't have clocks, by the way, because the Romans, I think, had water clocks. And a lot of this culture was Roman culture that continued. Uh, but people were probably just more used to paying attention to the sun. You know, when the sun was straight overhead, you knew it was noon. If you suddenly saw your shadow off to your side, you know you're getting later. So I would think people had a pretty intuitive understanding, but I'm not sure they didn't have some form of clock
Yeah,
either.
and as you're cooking,
Especially Byzantium. I'm sorry, what?
I was saying, and they also could be
Well,
tasting and testing it as they were cooking, and kind of figured that out that way. Deanna asks, when they mention coriander, do you use the seeds or just the leaves?
well, this is the annoying quirk about the English language distinction between cilantro and coriander, the
Yeah,
greens and the seeds. Because when you see coriander or coriandrum in Latin, sometimes you know by context that it's seeds. Like he talks about for lentil, he says a spoonful of coriander. You know that's powder. Uh, Sometimes he talks about using it in a stew along with other greens, so you know it's cilantro. But generally, when you're dealing with Latin, you have to guess by context which it is. And in Anthemus, the context is usually pretty clear, but not always. Sometimes. And I should point out something else about coriander is that for lentils, what he actually says is you can either use a spoonful of coriander, so there we know we're talking about the powder, but he also says you can use coriander root, cilantro
yeah,
root, which I haven't seen mentioned at all in any Roman cookbooks. It's used in Thai cooking. And I actually went to the trouble of going to a Thai supermarket and finding some. It doesn't have much flavor. I mean, if you want to go to a Thai supermarket and try and get some, you probably want to get a lot because to make it taste like anything, you would probably need quite a bit of it, especially if you had the sumac, which has, and the vinegar and the sumac would really
yeah.
overwhelm coriander root.
That's one of the interesting things about coriander. Even everything's edible on it: the flowers, the stems, the roots, all of that.
Oh, I've never had the flower.
They're delicious.
Oh, has to start growing coriander, clearly.
Yes. George asks, is there any information on how easy it would have been to obtain sumac back then?
Well, again, I'm not sure that Anthemus was being cautious there. I think it's probably something he saw in Byzantium, and it would have been very easy to get there because Persians use it even today. It wouldn't have been that hard if it was available at all in Gaul, and it's possible because we don't know absolutely everything that was. It probably wasn't much harder to get than any other spice. Spices in general came in often shipped from Egypt, wherever they came from originally, to Marseille. And Marseille, until it was sacked, was the main hub for spices. So if it was available at all, I've never seen any mention of it in archaeology. It probably wasn't much harder to get than other spices. But as I said in the talk, I have some doubt as to whether it was actually available to Teodoric or if Anthemus just had fond memories of it and noted it and forgot to say, oh, by the way, you don't really have it here, which he's very careful about elsewhere in his document. So.
I think you had mentioned it, but one person's asking, where did they get their rice?
Okay, this is very interesting because I first saw mention of rice in his work, and then there's actually a list of imports that I just didn't have time to look at, where you see rice being imported, uh, very likely again from Egypt. All this stuff was sort of centralized in Egypt and then sent to Marseille. It came in at Marseille, or right near it, a place called Fos. It turns out that rice was a standard ration for the centurions. So they've actually found rice in the north of France that was left by centurions. So that's one way they would have gotten it, from Romans giving it to their soldiers.
So it was around. Okay. Um, from the Frankish period, have any spices been found from archaeological contexts? I
I
think,
can't. Yeah, I mean, I can't think of any. The fact they found cilantro makes me wonder if they didn't find coriander, because you're more likely to find the seed of a green than the green itself. In that
yeah,
case, you would have found the coriander seed. I don't know of any finds of pepper or clove or ginger or anything of that sort now.
yeah. Roxanne asks, how do spikenard and costus taste?
Well, the closest thing I could find to costus was an herb from a Chinese herbal shop. And if that is indeed what costus is like, it tastes almost like earth. It's very woody. It's not really something you'd go looking for. The only spikenard I could find, there are actually several different kinds of nard to complicate matters, was valerian. And valerian tastes very soapy. It really tastes like eating soap. So neither one is much to modern taste. But also, I found equivalents to them. I'm not sure how close what I found was to what they ate at the time. But if you want to go around looking, there are various forms of valerian in like Asian shops, and Indian and Persian more likely, and then Chinese herbalists have some interesting equivalents to these.
Some people seem to be interested in the archaeological, food-related archaeological finds. Are there any good references, books, websites, or articles that relate to that?
There's all kinds of articles, but no single book. It's rather frustrating because Bonnie Efros wrote a whole book on food of the Merovingians, but it's really kind of theoretical look at it. And she says right at the start, I'm not going to look at the specific foods because other people have done that. In fact, other people haven't. I may be the first to actually go into it in some detail. You can go to Persee, Persee.fr, if you read French, and they have a bunch of archaeological reports, which often include various meats or greens, but you kind of have to correlate, which is what I've done here. For those who don't know, by the way, I have a Facebook page called Medieval Food Before the Crusades, where we discuss a lot of this and share a lot of these sources. But they're pretty varied sources is what it comes down to.
I have a question from Alana.
Oh, by the way, for people,
Go ahead.
I just want to say for people who don't know, on the Anglo-Saxon side, which is around the same period, but in Anglo-Saxon, you have Anne Hagen's work, which is a wonderful analysis, but it's on the English side, so certain things are necessarily going to differ. Okay, I'm sorry. What's the next?
Well, that'll get them started. Alana asks, what were the differences in travel cooking habits versus cooking at home?
Well, I don't know if they were enormously different unless somebody was using a Roman style stove. And even then, we actually have a grill that a Roman soldier left at Alesia. So they carried grills with them. This was a very portable period. And the Frankish banquets were often on boards set across trestles because they were mobile. And when I mentioned that other royal chef, we see this royal chef traveling with a tripod and a pot and andirons and a spit, and all this could be portable. So the same thing you would do at home, which was basically light a fire in the middle of your floor, which is what a lot of people did, and then maybe put a spit over it, maybe hang a pot over it. You could do that at a campfire. You could do it in almost any environment. And a lot of these people, when they were traveling, were hosted, especially if you're upscale, you're hosted by a monastery or a great lord. So you had access to the kitchen. But really, the distinction between travel and at home wasn't as fixed. And one of the reasons Charlemagne had all these instructions for his different estates was he would go from one estate to the next. He did have a palace in Aachen, but he went between his estates quite a bit. These were very traveling kings, very mobile aristocrats.
Mhm. Uh, Excellent. I have a couple more questions here. We have time for a few more. How closely would Frankish cuisine resemble the Norman cuisine of William the Conqueror?
Somewhat less, I think, partially because he was more northern, partially because, uh, the whole culture had evolved somewhat. At this point, France was France. It was no longer Frankish. There were resemblances. If you look at the Bayeux tapestry, uh, you have some idea of what they were doing. They seem to be cooking a stew in an animal's hide, which is a thing. You can actually take the hide of an animal and use it as a kind of big pot, and that's what they seem to be doing there. The formal meal we see in the Bayeux tapestry is people sitting uh, really in a style that's more typical of later medieval periods. But a lot of things would have been the same. The broad beans, again, everybody's eating broad beans. People roast birds. We don't know if they had, you know, the same spices at that point. They would have had a lot of the same ones. Yeah, I have to be careful because beyond the Bayeux tapestry, I don't know heaps about Norman cuisine, but I do know the Anglo-Norman cookbooks we have, which were from only a little bit later, begin to resemble the late medieval cookbooks more than they do Anthemus.
All right. Oh, yes, and another person has a similar question. How would the food of the Franks compare to Northern Europe or like today's Germany? I think,
Oh, it'd be very different because today's Germany has had so many other influences, and not to mention post-Columbian imports. So it would have been very different, I think.
okay, Maria asks, could the use of honey be accounted for the sour sweet characteristic of French food?
Well, I don't know that much sweet and sour modern French food. The use of honey was just so general. I mean, they coated meat with it when they roasted it. They put it on vegetables. Uh, they just seem to have done everything they could think of with honey. It was really ubiquitous in Frankish cooking.
Yeah.
Uh, but I know modern French cuisine fairly rare. I don't know many sweet and sour flavors in modern French cuisine.
Okay.
Maybe there's an example. I don't know.
Um, when did olives and olive oil come into the diet?
Well, olives had been along the coast pretty much forever. And so as soon as the Greeks came, they were probably making olive oil. The Romans occupied the coast long before they took over Gaul. So they were making olive oil and olives. Uh, and really, it was just the degree to which they were trading with the Romans that it went north. And then as the aristocrats became more Romanized, which they did fairly early on, they imported the olive oil from the south. So the Franks were probably more influenced by olive oil. Not so much olives. You don't see that many olives per se mentioned among the Franks, but olive oil certainly uh, probably around the time that they actually took over Gaul. As I say, Clovis's father already held rank in the Roman army, and Clovis probably knew the Roman lifestyle pretty well. But then again, you have Anthemus at the start of the 6th century saying if you can't find olive oil, use bacon fat. So clearly there was an issue with getting it.
Okay, I've got about three. We have time for about 3 more questions here. Let's see here. Were quince referred to as a cooking fruit?
Well, no, the idea of distinguishing between cooking fruit and normal fruit doesn't appear at all, so far as I know, until that one mention in De Villas. So the whole concept is fairly new. People did cook fruit, even in late medieval France. They used to sell baked apples in the street. So it wasn't specifically a cooking fruit any more than, hazelnuts were cooking nuts, but we have found them being cooked in a grave. I think people just looked for ways to enhance their food given relatively limited means, and they would cook cheese, they would cook fruit, they would cook nuts. But I don't think quince per se was considered a cooking fruit, no.
Okay. Let's see, Carrie asks, how did Frankish food compare to the food in the area that is in today's Germany, not the food in today's Germany? The question was, how did Frankish food compare to the food in the area that is today's Germany?
Well, I think we looked at that before.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
I think we answered it, I think, as best we can. And then finally, Daniel asks, in Scandinavian Viking Age context, porridges seem to have been a traveling food and is mentioned in a few sagas. Was there any particular reason for porridges to be associated with the upper classes apart from the recipes or finds using honey?
well, I don't know if they were only associated with the upper classes, but they were suitable to the upper classes. Whereas, you think of like the 18th century, gruel is something that a peasant would eat. Uh, in the early Middle Ages, first of all, I don't think the Franks had as much bread. They did have some, but it wasn't as central to their culture as it was to Roman culture. And one way to eat, probably the most intuitive way to eat grains is to boil them, and you end up with gruel. I don't know that it was, especially associated with the upper classes. The fact is, it wasn't in any way shaming or, it didn't reflect poorly on them to eat it. You see mentions in Charlemagne's time of people eating porridge at the table, but that doesn't mean that peasants didn't.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you. I think we're all out of time here. I want to thank you for such a fabulous presentation. And I'm super hungry now. We're getting people saying clap, 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 applause, applause. Very well received. Thank you, sir. Again, you can find his books on Amazon. And any last parting words?
I just remind people, if you're looking for how to cook an early French peacock, look for the 3rd edition. I should probably just take the 2nd edition out of circulation, really, because people still buy it. Yeah, I do hope you'll go find it. His work, Anthemus's work, really is filled with things if you parse it out and look at it closely. Yeah. And I would like to thank everybody for coming and listening as well.
All right, and well, thank you, and everyone. This presentation it's been recorded, so it will be online. We're going to post it to the Culinary Historians of San Diego's YouTube channel shortly. And our next presentation next month will be the fabulous soda fountain with Charles Perry, and that'll be May 15th, Saturday. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next month. And thank you, Jim, very much.